Shadowversity.
I don't like YouTube drama, and in actual fact I try and ignore nearly all of the disingenuous criticism that's lobbed against me. Valid criticism I love. I love being corrected, I love knowing what the truth is, and whenever anyone validly corrects me, I love it, and I share it with you guys. I post it on the community tab, I share the videos in the description of the video they're applying to. I have no problem at all being wrong. Now, there is a YouTube channel called NUsensei who doesn't believe I follow that practice because when it came to his criticism, I didn't take it on board. In fact, I listened to it as honestly as I could, and the more I listened, the more I disagreed with him. So I left a comment to his first video that he didn't respond very positively to. It seems like he doesn't have very thick skin and doesn't like to admit he's wrong when he's wrong. Even though in his reply to my comment, he admitted that he misunderstood what I was saying, and when understood what I was saying in context, he had very little to criticize me about. But of course, he left the video up, and that hasn't stopped him from continually criticizing me for completely disingenuous and false reasons. And we will get into them because some of the things he claims I have said is the exact opposite and is actually repeating what I said, but claiming I didn't say that I said the opposite, and therefore showing me to be a disingenuous idiot. And it was the fallout of my reply to his first video, which I take as a bit of evidence to show that he doesn't take criticism well, is the reason why he doesn't like me, and he has said so.
I have an unhealthy dislike of Shadowversity.
Why doesn't he like me? Well, the only interaction we had before then was the fact that I called him out on his disingenuous criticism against me. I defended myself, and he obviously didn't like it because he doesn't like me as a result. Now, is that true? Look, it's speculation. Maybe he doesn't have thick skin, and the reason he gives that he doesn't like me is that he can't understand what I say.
He goes on this barely coherent rant. He does all this weird straw man stuff, which makes absolutely no sense.
It's my fault that he can't understand me, even when most other people who do listen to me do understand me. Most people, like the very large majority. So whose fault is it then that Nu can't understand what I'm saying? I'd say it's his. And it has happened so often, like he's made now 3 videos where I come up in, where he has disparaged my credibility very disingenuously, that it's come to the point that I feel like I need to make a reply to defend my credibility. Especially considering these videos are still up. Even that first one, in which he admitted most of his criticisms were invalid, and what's really happened, he misunderstood what I said, he was happy to leave that up. And how many people actually really read the comments, right? And so he's perfectly happy to let those people who watch his video get the wrong impression of me, that I don't know what I'm talking about, I'm unreliable, all because of his own inability to understand what I'm saying. And at first I was reluctant to think of his criticisms as disingenuous, only that he misunderstood. He watched my videos, didn't understand what I was saying, and then was criticizing something that I never even said in the first place, so it was an inadvertent, accidental straw man, yet he has repeatedly done it, okay? So far, 3 videos where I come up to my knowledge, there might be more, and most of the criticisms that he brings up are completely inaccurate and out of context, and I will show you exactly what I mean. Why? Because he even overtly, explicitly contradicts himself in 2 of his videos. My goodness. And if it's happening so often, I kind of feel like he is approaching my videos, my content in bad faith, where he expects me to say incorrect things because he doesn't like me, and is looking so hard for those incorrect things that he isn't even paying attention to what I'm actually saying, misunderstands things and takes them out of context. So it's either that, the disingenuous approach, or he's a complete idiot and is completely unable to pay attention to things said that are clear enough that most people can understand them. But I can certainly respect his desire to correct misinformation. I do that myself, okay? I try and do it with a bit more respect, especially with the people I'm criticizing, and I'm not criticizing them, I'm criticizing what they have said. And so these are signs to me that this guy is acting in bad faith, in all honesty, and he deserves to be called out as a result of it. I didn't want to do this. I'm a much larger channel, okay? I didn't want it to feel like this big guy picking on this little guy. I said that in my very first reply, which is why I didn't make a reply video to him, because when there is so little that I can acknowledge was valid in their criticism, such a reply video would reflect very negatively on the person I'm replying to. Well, because he has left the video up and kept on going, and it's just gotten worse, more disingenuous, more dishonest, he deserves it. So now let's go into the meat of how he has misrepresented me so disingenuously. Actually, let me just say before we go into it, there are some valid criticisms that he has brought up. And those things I have nothing against. I like being corrected when there's room to be corrected, but those are few and far between, and for the large majority of everything he has said is being very disingenuous and out of context. And I'll start with the greatest offender. It's his video on the right type of bow, where the entire video, the whole point of the video is to point out the inaccuracy, okay, the error that I myself, like, focuses on me as the prime example of someone who has used the wrong bow to make a demonstration of something and therefore reached a wrong conclusion. Yet that is the exact thing I was saying with the bow I was using in the video he's criticizing. We are saying the exact same thing, yet somehow he has taken that and reversed completely the point of what I was saying through his own inability to pay attention, it seems, and then is criticizing me. And this is the annoying thing, okay? When you are expressing something logically, because his argument is logic, okay? It makes sense if what I said was incorrect, okay? If anyone said what he says I said, I would be with him criticizing it as well, okay? He's right in that sense. And because of that, everyone who watches this video, oh, he's absolutely right. And therefore, Shadiversity must be an idiot who doesn't know what he's saying. In my video, I was trying to explore the pros and cons of different styles of archery with kind of a focus on shooting on the left side or the right side of the bow. And somehow, from watching my video, Nu thinks that I was saying that when you put the arrow on the right side of the bow, it offsets its angle to a greater degree, making it more difficult, which I never said. I said with the bow I was holding, it offsets it greater, and you wouldn't have that problem if it was a straight shaft. Listen to what I said. Now, of course, I could still fire this bow with the arrow on the right side, but it's kind of awkward. If I kind of show you, do you see the angle in which the the arrow is getting pointed off? Like that's what's happening, okay? It's getting pointed off on the side because not only is the shaft in the way, there's more meat on this side pushing the arrow further out. It's not just a straight shaft. So this design actually makes right-sided archery shooting even more difficult than if it was just a plain shaft.
Look, all this is bollocks, because he's using the wrong bow.
So this design actually makes right-sided archery shooting even more difficult than if it was just a plain shaft.
You can't shoot from the right side of this bow, so of course everything looks wrong. So not only is he using the wrong technique for this side of the bow, he's also using the wrong bow for this side of the bow.
So this design...
And if I have this in my hand, I'm gonna go, yeah, that's impossible, you can't do it this way. But again, I have to recognize I'm using the wrong equipment for the demonstration.
So this design actually makes right-sided archery shooting even more difficult than if it was just a plain shaft.
I have to recognize I'm using the wrong equipment for the demonstration.
Meaning if I wasn't holding the bow I was holding, a bow that was a straight shaft, ambidextrous on either side, the arrow wouldn't be offset. The biggest issue I was explaining about having the arrow on the right side of the bow was that the shaft of the bow was in the way of your line of sight, which, to my understanding, in all the ways I can analyze it, that's still correct.
So is the left side more accurate? Well, yes, it does allow you to get more visual on the target.
But Nu doesn't address that. No, he creates a straw man and is saying, well, look, of course it's offset this much, and then he goes further, okay? I didn't even bring up this point, but he full-on contradicts himself, okay? He then starts to spread complete misinformation where he says that there is no difference in aiming or technique or speed, regardless on which side you place the arrow, which is contradicted by his own words when he says, use the thumb drawer, a different technique when you shoot on the right side of the bow. Let's listen to him.
Somehow, throughout his research and preparation for the video, he never comes across the thumb drawer, which is how people shoot from the right side of the bow as a right-handed archer. If he actually had the right bow for the job, he would actually see for himself that this actually has no impact on aiming or technique or speed. It's the same this way or this way, which is how people shoot from the right side of the bow. So is the left side more accurate? Well, yes, it does allow you to get more visual on the target. This actually has no impact on aiming or technique or speed. So is the left side more accurate? Well, yes, it does allow you to get more visual on the target. It's the same this way or this way.
Oh, so there is a difference, at least in technique, according to your understanding, when you're shooting on the right side as opposed to the left side. And I will go further to say that there is an inherent difference in the speed. It will be different between different individuals. One person might be faster shooting on the right side because he's trained more, but if he instantly shoots to a way that he hasn't shot, on the other side, hasn't trained with it, of course that's going to affect his aiming and speed. He says on this side or that side is completely the same. Perhaps, let me give him the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he is trying to say that if you trained, okay, whatever technique, okay, with training and practice, you can reach the same accuracy levels, speed. Technique, no. Okay, you have to use a different technique depending on the very fact the arrow is on a different side in and of itself is inherently a different technique. Okay, but perhaps with training, there's no difference in aim or speed. And that I don't fully agree with. I'm not sure. I feel that there is inherently different biomechanics based on the different techniques you need to use, and the maximum speed and accuracy you can attain is inherently going to be different based on these different techniques that you're using. That perhaps these techniques inherently give certain advantages and disadvantages to speed and accuracy. That's not to say that someone who is just more talented with, say, a style or technique of shooting that perhaps affects accuracy to a greater degree than another style can achieve greater accuracy than someone who's using a different style because he's trained that much and is better. I'm not, so of course, absolutely granted. I'm saying all things being equal, okay? There will be inherent strengths and disadvantages to different techniques that you use that will affect aiming and speed as opposed to another for an individual archer. And I don't think that is unreasonable to say or inaccurate. If I am, I would love to know if you can actually address the exact thing that I'm saying. Now, we will go to the very video where he does try and show different techniques have no effect on aiming and speed, okay? Because this is one of his first replies to me, but the way he goes about it is such like confirmation bias through the roof. It's astounding that he really thinks what he did, shows his argument. It doesn't, but we'll get there, okay? What I'm saying here is the main point of this video is arguing against something I never said. And I'm talking about the main point, not the tangential points, but even the tangential point that the side of the bow that you're shooting on, even if it's a bow that's made, ambidextrous, will have no difference on technique, which it absolutely will, by his own admission in the very video. One might even say that the video is barely coherent, but the thing is, being barely coherent means that it is coherent to a certain level, but you're contradicting yourself in your own video, so I couldn't even call it coherent. My goodness. Okay, so anyway, that's the greatest offender in my mind. The whole video is just trash. But he has just released a new video, which once again, I come up as his favorite straw man target. Now, generally, the point of this video isn't inaccurate, okay? There are many different types of archery that exist in many different parts of the world. And the main criticism of this video is that there's too much focus on the longbow, which I might agree if you took me out of context. So whenever I'm talking about the longbow, in what sphere am I generally talking? Medieval history and medieval fantasy. And so he's criticizing me for being Eurocentric when the very context of what I'm talking about is Eurocentric. So of course it's going to be. Now, when you go to fantasy, absolutely, you can actually step outside of the sphere of European history and medieval history and kind of grab things from other cultures. Like, say, you could grab Mongolian horse archery and give it to a fantasy race, elves or something like that. That's completely valid, and that's an inventive thing to try and bring up. Let's look at other things outside of, European medieval history to see how we could bring it into medieval fantasy. Classic medieval fantasy with elves, dwarves, dragons, and all that. But instead of trying to expand upon the discussion that I love about fantasy, which I would have been fully on board with, he's criticizing me and saying I'm perpetuating the myth that all archery is only European focused. Now look, I love European history, okay? So whenever I think about archery, the type I love most, of course, is going to be focused on the culture that I have the deepest interest in and a history point, and it's going to be medieval. And when you think about medieval archery, English longbow, Welsh longbow, but the difference between English and Welsh longbow, they're almost exactly the same. It's just the point of who you attribute it to. But anyway, they're identical bows, and that's one of the most iconic, awesome bows ever. Speaking about European medieval history specifically, the next part of this video, which is a focal point of criticism, is the focus on draw weight, that you always want something powerful. And he goes on to say and describe that, no, people again, taking me outside of the context that I'm speaking in. What do I speak in? Medieval fantasy, okay? Medieval history and fantasy, but always around a combat war scenario and situation. And he starts to talk about, well, you don't need as powerful bows when you're going hunting casually, okay? Or if you're just using casual use, normal level strength bows are completely adequate, which I completely agree with. That's not what I was talking about. I was talking about an adventurer, and the only point where he tries to describe an adventurer being like that they would be happy to use a lower poundage bow is if they're just casually hunting for food, you know, rabbits or deer. And that it seems like he's saying he feels that a ranger would have a lower poundage bow for casual use.
Most of the times, these characters are not using warbows, and they're not in positions where they have to use warbows.
And that might be valid in some situations, but a ranger in fantasy isn't just dealing with rabbits and deer, they're dealing with huge dire animals, like a dire bear that's as big as an elephant. And in those situations, I would say having the most powerful bow you can handle would be your priority. We're talking warbow levels, which is the strength of bows you would want when fighting monsters and any other humanoid opponent with moderate levels of armor. And also, let me just point out again, he contradicts himself in this video. He says that in reality, a guy using a 70-pound bow is exactly the same as if he was using a larger bow. And trying to understand the context he's saying, it seems like in the context in the general use that he would want.
In reality, someone using a 70-pound longbow is just as useful as anything else.
But previously in his video, he explains a specific point in which you would not want a lower poundage bow. And that's when you're shooting against someone who is wearing armor. What's the point of having a heavy war bow? Well, he says armor. I agree armor, but I would also say range as well.
Now, of course, you might think, but why do you have 100-pound bows? Simple reason is armor. If your opponent has armor, then you would probably require a much higher draw weight and a much heavier arrow. Rangers, so their purpose is not to shoot a high draw weight to pierce through armor. Now, of course, we're talking about fantasy, we extend a lot of rules, like how armor is made from cardboard, but in reality, someone using a 70-pound longbow is just as useful as anything else.
Now that is clearly inaccurate and untrue. There are many situations in which a 70-pound bow is not as effective as one that's much more powerful. And he does not specify here that he is only referring to hunting and casual use. Even contextualizing this and going off what he said previously, he says that for a fantasy ranger, their purpose is not to shoot a higher draw weight and pierce through armor, which in the context of a fantasy ranger is totally inaccurate. Of course fantasy rangers come up against armor. But in his world, for a ranger that's only hunting deer and rabbits, yes, a 70-pound longbow is perfectly fine. And in that context, of course, I understand what he's saying. But he doesn't specify this. This is me having to explain his own context. He says, in reality, someone using a 70-pound longbow is just as useful as anything else. Not just as useful for hunting and general things, anything else. Yet I'm willing to grant him the concession that he has never granted me and say this is probably a slip of the tongue. And if I was to go off his exact wording and not give him his concession, he blatantly contradicts himself. So once again, taking me out of context and applying a criticism upon me that doesn't even actually apply if you understood what I'm really talking about. Most of my videos, it's all about fantasy, okay? And what are the things you're finding in fantasy? People wearing armor, usually, and really big creatures that, yes, a 70-pound bow can kill a deer. Will a 70-pound bow be as effective against a dragon as a 200-pound bow? No. For the fantasy adventurer, they would generally want the highest pound bow that they can manage. Now, are there other bows historically that were as powerful as the classic English warbow or longbow? Of course there are. I generally default to the most iconic medieval one for that setting and context. And other bows of equivalent poundage, okay, that you can find in a medieval setting that were not from, England, like for instance the Vikings had really powerful bows, okay, and so that would technically be a Scandinavian type of bow, but they look almost exactly like longbows, or not that much different. So that is that video, and the first video he made in response to me was in direct response to my video on archery. I hope you guys can understand that each one of these videos I have approached with the mindset of, okay, is there anything valid in what he is saying, okay? Can I take on board anything that he has? And some things I have taken on board, like perhaps looking outside of medieval culture in expanding the breadth of fantasy and incorporating other things from other archery cultures and stuff in a medieval fantasy setting, because you have that freedom in fantasy. So look, things taken on board, okay? I try and do this. And with this first video criticism, I really full on approach this. And I was actually kind of excited. I was like, oh, cool. All right. Another reply. I love reply videos. I share them heaps in my community tab, okay? And so I approached this all fully ready to take on board. Had my notes out. And as the video started and then kept going and kept going and kept going, the whole video is criticizing things that I said taken out of context and being misunderstood. And I said this very much in the reply. Credit to Nu, he pinned my comment up the top. His reply was a bit disingenuous and also a little bit, offended because I said it really seems like you approach this video trying to misunderstand it. He took issue with that, but I think his track record now has kind of almost proven it in my mind that especially when he is full-on misrepresents me, like that, first criticism I brought out, where he's literally saying I said the opposite thing of what I said. How can you not do that unless you are full-on approaching that with the intent to misunderstand? And I feel like this is just conjecture now, but I feel like the reason why people would want to do this is by making reply videos to larger channels, they get attention and stuff like that. And so if they have something to say, that's great. It also increases their own credibility in being able to say, no, that was wrong and I know why you're wrong and stuff like that. And so that's the disingenuous side of making reply videos. There can be really positive reasons for making reply videos in extending the discussion, approaching things in good faith, and also pointing out the good things that people do as well. Because this is the thing about Nu. He can make some really good content about archery. And I almost feel like one of the reasons he's been so insistent in making reply videos to me is that he wants me to reply, to get the attention and exposure. And that's an impression I have. I'm not saying it is, it's just the impression. And because this is the thing, if I make a reply video, I'm going to do it honestly, okay? And I'm not going to say that they're barely coherent and things like that. I'll point out when they are, but as I mentioned, other videos he can make are really good. And there you go, he achieved what he wanted in a very disingenuous way. And so even though he can make, good videos, the ease in which he can misunderstand fairly clearly spoken points really undermines my trust and credibility in him going into the future. My goodness. Because as I mentioned before, the thing he's trying to correct is incorrect. It's just that I didn't say those things, okay? If you understood what I was saying in the correct context. And so going now to the first reply, the most valid criticism he mentions in this video, which he doesn't expand upon, he only mentions them tangentially and actually doesn't go into the valid points he could have raised, was the things I omitted in my video. Like I didn't mention the thumb draw and other certain archery techniques that add additional interesting discussion to the whole point of different archery techniques and the pros and cons. This is a good example of the type of criticism in this video specifically, that he criticizes me for explaining that the archery technique you use is going to be a matter of personal preference, and he takes that to mean that I'm saying it's a matter of personal preference in lieu of what is most effective, when for me I think it would be quite evident that your personal preference would be the thing that is most effective, not in lieu of it. But that's exactly what he tries to imply what I'm saying, and then goes on to criticize me for it, which is a completely disingenuous thing to criticize, because my meaning was your personal preference would of course be what's most effective. My goodness. And I explain this in my comment, that it seems like the way he's approached my video is that he has looked at everything I said and tried to find the most incorrect way of interpreting what I said and then assumed that was my meaning, when no. Give me some benefit of the doubt, please.
Archery was first a survival skill, then a military skill. Preference is a modern luxury. I can choose what style of archery I want to do based on what I like. Historically, that choice was made for you.
So Nu takes this point of personal preference and effectiveness, which are intrinsically connected by the way, but he takes it way too far, to the point where he is literally saying that personal preference didn't exist in the past at all, which is a complete and total load of bull.
Historically, that choice was made for you.
He is saying that an individual archer couldn't decide whether he wanted to have a quiver on his hip or back, that things like this was determined for you. Absolute bullcrap.
The equipment used and the technique that goes with it is based on need, not preference.
Incorrect. It's both, not one or the other. Many soldiers and archers needed to equip themselves. They had to provide their own weapons and armor. And when they did this, of course they could choose a different bow than what was standard, such as one with a much higher draw weight that suited them more. Would an English archer pick a Mongolian horsebow instead? No, and I never said that! This is another stupid analogy that Nu is making based on taking me completely out of context.
An archer in the English army could not choose the way he would nock the arrow or hold the bow.
Where on earth did he get that idea from? And also, what point in time is he referencing? Because he's speaking very generally here, and he seems to fail to realise that the medieval period was a very long period in time, and the English army looked very differently depending on time period. But he says categorically that an archer in the English army could not choose the way he would nock the arrow, when in actual fact many English archers were self-taught. There was a law dating back to the 13th century telling men to practice archery every Sunday. They're not being told how to do this by a drill sergeant, they're practicing themselves. They are self-taught. Not in every instance, but this is the generality. Now, would cultural norms and techniques be the things that they would generally adopt? Of course, but not universally, and discounting personal preference entirely, which is what Nu is doing, is utterly ridiculous. The amount of fingers they are using on the string, whether they are right-handed or left-handed, where the quiver is being held on the hip or on the back, and the side of the bow that you're shooting from. Any of those things can be easily altered based on the archer's personal preference, which would be based on what he found to be most effective. If he fires better or faster one way, of course he's going to do it that way.
Oh, I prefer to stand still and shoot a heavy warbow at long distance. But you're in the Mongol horde, and your empire's devastating conquest was on the back of legendary mounted archery.
Now, Nu takes my analogy completely out of context, applying it to things that I wasn't even talking about. I was talking about different drawing methods and shooting styles. Things can be altered regardless on whether you're on horseback or on foot. Not that being on foot when you're in an army that was mounted could be a preference that you could choose to do differently. But that is what Nu is trying to demonstrate what the ultimate conclusion of saying personal preference was a thing would lead to, which is just stupid. He then equates my use of historical references in the same way that Lars Anderson does, which is again disingenuous. Lars Anderson has used historical artwork to try and claim and, establish that certain archery techniques were used in greater amount, as a greater preference than certain other archery techniques. That's never what I said in showing the references artworks that I did. I simply showed them to show that these techniques were used historically. I didn't even go into which one was more prominent. I just used them as evidence to indicate that these techniques were used historically, which guess what? They are! Now, Nu does go into a big rant about how inaccurate, unreliable artwork can be, and that does, there's some validity to the inaccuracy of artwork, liberties are taken, but that doesn't mean it should be discounted completely, which really seems like that's what he's saying, that because it's unreliable, you shouldn't even take it as, a point of evidence at all, when, no, medieval artwork, and ancient whatever artwork is excellent evidence, Even though there are unreliable things about it, doesn't mean that they are not instructive, My goodness. Anyway, that's the impression I got from what he was saying. If he was saying something different, if he was not saying that historical artwork should be disregarded completely, I withdraw that criticism, happily.
Many depictions of the arrow on the bow were simply on the wrong side, because it was easier to draw or sew a straight line to represent the shaft, regardless of which side was actually used.
It's interesting that Nu assumes some artworks to be accurate and some to be inaccurate based on what he thinks was done historically. That's called confirmation bias. He instantly assumes an arrow was depicted on the wrong side of the bow in a tapestry because of the difficulty in sewing. Now, of course, that might be the case, but you know what also might be the case? That the arrow is actually put on that side as well. And an easy way to debunk this is to see if the arrow was put on the opposite side of the bow from the perspective of the tapestry itself. And look at that, it was done. So an arrow being placed on either side of a bow in this tapestry was an intentional thing. Maybe because it was actually done historically.
Regarding the discussion on which side to nock the arrow, he makes the statement that the equipment necessitates a certain style of loading.
Only in the context of the specific bow I was holding, which, interestingly enough, is the exact same thing Nu says in a later video, that when holding that type of bow, you would not want to shoot on the right side with it.
And if I have this in my hand, I'm going to go, yeah, that's impossible, you can't do it this way.
His continuing discussion here that the bows are designed based on the techniques adopted is completely irrelevant because he's arguing against something I didn't even say. So of course he's correct in this point, but once again, he's arguing against a straw man. Easy to make yourself look smart and intelligent with a logical argument when you're creating your opponent for yourself. Nu seems to have a bit of a personal grudge against speed shooting, and I think it might stem out of the popularity of Lars Anderson.
Speed shooting. Overrated.
So much to the point, it's almost like he's trying to discount any, validity in speed shooting. That is, as soon as you reach a moderate level of, reloading and loosing, that's perfectly fine. And I still disagree with him, especially if you're trying to take this archery into fantasy scenario. And I mean, he criticizes my almost flippant just remark about if someone's charging you with a sword, you're going to want to be able to fire or loose as fast as possible. And again, fire, loose, it's just normal language, okay?
A true archer would not use the word fire in a discussion. So this may or may not take away from the credibility of Shadowversity's discussion.
This is what's called a no true Scotsman fallacy, and guess what? Nu is telling you, regardless of your experience with archery, that you are not a true archer if you use the word fire instead of shoot. If I was writing a book set in a medieval period, I wouldn't use fire, but people understand what I'm saying when I use fire, and so I made a whole video on the evolution of language. And regardless, his criticism of the analogy of the swordsman charging at you doesn't discount the analogy. He goes on to explain that there are other situations in which speed is not nearly as useful. Of course. But there would be other situations, like on top and separate to a swordsman charging at you, in which speed would be useful. Nu even goes so far to point out completely irrelevant things, okay, separate to, the points of archery, that, if you thought about, obviously, of course, like for instance, where I say bullets don't arc. Of course I know that bullets arc. I was speaking as a matter of contrast. Over similar distances, it's almost like bullets don't arc over the same distances in which you would be shooting an arrow. But bullets can move a much further distance, and over really long distances they of course arc, but you don't really need to take that into account too much when you're firing within the same ranges as you would generally use a bow. Now that is of course the obvious context in which I was speaking, but once again, he tries to interpret it in the most disingenuous way possible and misrepresent it in any way he can and again, it's so minute and tangential to the real, point of the video that I feel like the only reason you'd want to bring it up is just to kind of emphasize, look at how many things he's getting wrong. He doesn't even know that bullets arc. He must be a complete idiot and I'm so smart because I'm correcting him in all these ways. Now, his main and last point is by far his most disingenuous. It's the one that I kind of mentioned earlier on in this video. So when he goes on to show different shooting techniques to try and demonstrate that, look, there is not much difference in the rate of fire between all these different techniques, when it is so painfully obvious that he is purposefully trying to shoot at the same rate. I could show you other videos of someone doing it much, much faster. But from your analysis, you seem to be implying that that type of shooting will have the same rate of fire as any other type of shooting, regardless of the individual archer doing it. I'm willing to bet, I don't have exact proof, but I can almost guarantee that, say, this wonderful lady here is loosing arrows this way, that she would not be able to shoot as fast using a different technique that she had not trained in as much. And if you trained as much as he could in different techniques, certain techniques are inherently going to have certain advantages in speed as others, even if it's small, but small differences in speed can actually equate to large ones over a very long period, well, not even a very long period. And what about a short period of time? How many arrows can you fire in 1 minute? And yes, I'm purposely using fire because in the context of this video, it doesn't matter. People still understand what I'm saying. The only claim that Nu can have about his test here is that for him, he did not have any real difference in speed. That's the only thing he can gain out of it. And to me, it's quite obvious that he's not trying to shoot as fast as possible with all these different techniques. His main point is that he feels speed is a matter of practice, not technique. Whatever technique you use, whatever you practice more with, you're eventually going to get fast at it.
At the end of the day, speed is purely a product of practice. It doesn't matter what style you use, you are only as fast as you practice.
My point is that that is partially correct, but technique is also going to play an effect as well. I already mentioned this, previously in the video. Nu says that the differences in speed between these techniques are marginal. But you don't measure the differences when you try these techniques with the intent to make them marginally the same in speed. You would honestly practice with each technique, get competent at it, and then time yourself. How many arrows can you shoot within a minute with each different technique as fast as you can with the pure honest intent But I doubt you'd ever do that, honestly, because I'm very confident to say that if you did that, you would find that you would be faster with certain techniques and not as fast as with other techniques. Let's find the fastest speed shooter in the world. Is it Lars Anderson? I don't know. It might be, but I'm sure there's a record somewhere. And if we ask that individual, can you match that record with a completely different technique, one that you're still trained in, but with a different technique, can you match that speed? I would say that no, they can't. You didn't prove anything by your disingenuous and just completely bullcrap demonstration. It's comical, my goodness. At this point in the video, I've seen Nu contradict himself so many times that I actually started to suspect that he has probably contradicted himself on this point as well. So, out of interest, I simply went to his channel, did a search on speed, and clicked on the first video that came up. Now, the points he actually makes in the video itself were fairly consistent to his overall theme, although this video specifically was saying the side in which you shoot an arrow on a bow doesn't affect speed. His broader criticism and reply to me in his video was that technique doesn't affect speed. And personally, I feel the side of the bow that you shoot from will affect speed to some marginal level. But when I went to his comments section, there was a pinned comment written by himself, which he says this: without significant modifications to equipment and technique, the two archers he is referencing in the video are pretty much at the maximum of what a person can physically achieve in shooting speed. Meaning, by his own admission, that with a modification upon technique, a person can reach a higher rate of fire, speed shooting, than what they were able to achieve using a different technique. It's such an obvious fact that I was sure even he would have admitted it at some point, and it didn't take too much searching for me to find it. The big comparison here is with Lars Anderson, and even though people criticize Lars for not drawing the bow to its full length, if he did, he would still be much faster than other people using different techniques. And Lars Anderson, according to Nu himself, has a per shot rate of 0.5 seconds. That is more than half than some of the closest contenders. And even if he drew the string to full draw, that would only increase his per shot rate by maybe double. To make his per shot rate 1 second each, that puts him still considerably faster than many other people using different techniques. So once again, Nu's argument is hypocritical and self-contradictory. And so those are the things that I wanted to reply to. I mean, so many of these criticisms are just completely out of context bullcrap. The unfortunate thing with reply videos like this is it usually sours the waters and burns the bridge and makes goodwill between the two parties rather impossible, but I will happily say I'm more than willing to bury the hatchet about all of this. I personally think that if he is truly an honest, intellectual individual, regardless of what he now thinks about me for how aggressive and critical I've been in my reply, if he was at least honest with himself and wanted to show that he can learn from his mistakes, that he would do something about those incorrect videos that he still has up and public. Especially the one where the entire video is attacking something I didn't say and he contradicts himself. That is just trash. As what I do, when I make a video that is so drastically horrible and incorrect, okay, I could either put in those annotations over the whole length of the video saying the video is incorrect, which I still have, and you know, there's a video up there like that, or I take the video down, because that's the honest thing to do. And honestly, if Nu does that and apologizes in some measure, I'm more than happy to bury the hatchet and be mates with him, but it's left with him. And from his responses, especially the response to my comment on his first video, he doesn't seem to be the type of person who can take criticism well. But I guess we'll find out. I more suspect that he'll double down and make a reply video to this reply video just to get the, you know, reaction, likes, attention, and shift the blame back onto me in some way like he did with his commented reply, saying that it's my fault for not being clear enough of being able to explain myself because I'm just a barely coherent rambler. And I am a rambler, but by the fact most people understand what I'm saying seems to indicate to me that I at least do good enough of a job. Not perfect, but I try. So thanks for watching, guys. I feel like I needed to clear my name a little bit, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. So until then, farewell.
But we also have a responsibility to make sure our information is as fair and accurate as possible, because the people who know less than us depend on us for that information. And if we can't give them that accuracy, then we're doing them a disservice.